Okay, yeah. Are you ready?
Yeah. Okay. Right, today I'm going to talk to you about pre-Raphaelism. Pre-Raphaelism was an artistic and literary movement that combined both art and literature, particularly poetry. Many of the works which the movement produced were inspired by kind of classical literature and the Bible. For example, the image on the left-hand side of the screen is a pre-Raphaelite painting by Ford Madox Brown, displaying a scene from Shakespeare's King Lear. The image on the right of the screen is a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Although it's very sort of sensuous and sumptuous in its depiction of female beauty, Rossetti inscribed the frame with sort of biblical quotations, because it's inspired by a passage from the Song of Solomon. The combination of classical imagery and sumptuous colours is quite typical of pre-Raphaelite art. However, there's little more coherency to the movement due to the kind of reactionary origins of the movement. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was formed in around 1848. Its founders were William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, along with some others who were sort of more minor in the movement. They were kind of united in a desire to rebel against the Victorian art establishment. However, they were generally quite different artists in both their technical skills and their ideals and the things that they were interested in painting. But they did want to rebel together against their school, the Royal Academy, which they saw as morally disinterested and quite turgid in its style, with overly constricting rules. Rather than following a constrained doctrine that Victorian artists generally followed at the time, they gave themselves a loose set of rules, which are shown under their aims, with rules such as produce thoroughly good pictures and statues. They were a lot more free to express themselves in the way that they saw fit, and that gave them the ability to break social conventions. There's perhaps an element of irony that they chose to rebel against the system by using a retrospective approach to aesthetics. They were criticised for being antiquated by the Times newspaper, and in one article the Times said that they affected simplicity in painting, which is to genuine art what the medieval ballads and design and punch are to Chaucer and Giotto. As well as rejecting the rigid rules that art gave sort of technically to their artists, they rejected the image of the Victorian woman in their depiction of females. For example, the traditional Victorian woman seen on the left-hand side of the screen is shown with her hair tightly bound back and a tight-fitting corset, and in a very controlled sort of stance, which is supposed to represent her kind of mental and physical sort of constraint and control of herself. Whereas the pre-Raphaelite woman is shown in a much more lifelike pose, with her hair flowing and loose clothes and a lot more flesh on display. The free-flowing hair and clothes of the pre-Raphaelite woman suggest a more active woman, which would have been quite shocking to a lot of Victorian viewers. She often has unbound, sort of flowing, loose hair, which at the time was a symbol of sort of maybe the fallen woman, slightly more sexually active and woman. This is particularly a feature in Dante Rossetti's work, which we can see in the centre here. The majority of his sort of depictions of women showed sort of red-haired, kind of more fierce-looking women with sort of very distinctive features. The critic John Dixon Hunt attributes this style of beautiful women to the idea of the muse. He believes that Rossetti saw these women as a projection of the artist's soul. This isn't to suggest that the pre-Raphaelites as a movement were sort of feminists, or proto-feminists. They weren't necessarily, because often, as we can see in some of these paintings, the women are sort of visually tantalising and more to be looked at and enjoyed. They aren't themselves necessarily sexually knowing. They're just very, they're sexually provocative to look at. As well as being a painter of classical images, Dante Gabriel Rossetti also produced his own poetry, which we can see here, is a poem called A Sonnet. He's also used typically pre-Raphaelite imagery to illuminate his drawing, to illuminate his poetry, which is something that he also did for other pre-Raphaelite poets, such as Alfred Tennyson and his sister Christina Rossetti. The pre-Raphaelite stylization and sort of slightly more sexualized image of the woman can be seen in these two woodcut illustrations, which Dante and Rossetti did for A Palace of Art by Lord Tennyson. The image on the left is from a section talking about Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music. In the Tennyson poem, she's described as, or in a clear walled city on the sea, near gilded organ pipes, her hair with white roses slept Saint Cecily, an angel looked at her. However, as we can see in Dante's representation of this scene, she's not asleep, she's active and awake and playing the organ, while the angel, rather than simply looking at her, is leaning over to kiss her, which brings a sort of more sexual theme to the scene. In Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, there are also pre-Raphaelite themes in the fact that it's morally contemplative and retrospective, and uses a sort of mythic fairy tale style. Rossetti claimed that it was no more than a fairy tale and that it didn't have any sexual content. However, it can easily be read as a critique on females' position within society and their lack of control over their own sexuality. The image of forbidden fruit is used throughout the poem and can easily be seen as sort of the areas of life that women weren't allowed to sort of explore themselves. Throughout the poem, there's several sexually suggestive passages which speak about the dangers of women losing control of their own sexuality and their virtue. In this passage, the character of Lizzie refuses to allow the advances of the goblins, who press their fruit against her lips, and even though they coaxed her and fought her, assaulting her violently, she refuses to open lip from lip, to shout out in pain or to laugh when she realises that she's defeated them. Because of her resistance to this sort of metaphorical sexual attack. She's rewarded when her silver penny is thrown back to her and she's allowed to return to her sister and eventually lead a happy life. She becomes happily married and has children. It's, however, not a didactic poem. The other female character, named Laura, is successfully tempted by the goblins and does taste their fruit. She effectively sells herself, as we can see in this image here. She sells a lock of her hair to gain a taste of the fruit. However, she, on finding that her sister too has been subjected to the goblins' treatment, she seems to instantly repent and genuinely be miserable about her sister's suffering, feeling that her undoing is her fault. In an attempt to save her sister, Laura kisses away the juices, even though she is loath to do so. It leads her into a scorching fit, which eventually turns out to be her repentance and her redemption. She too eventually becomes married with children and leads a happy life. This reading complements Christina Rossetti's view on the fallen woman in Victorian society, as she was actively involved in charity work to help redeem prostitutes in London rather than sort of condemning the fallen woman. The morally and culturally interested stance of both of these poems and much pre-Raphaelite art is a very significant part of the movement itself. Indeed, the visual style is also very important as a running theme throughout. However, the moral and social stance, which often didn't follow the same path for the pre-Raphaelites, did bring a sort of intellectual elements to pre-Raphaelite art, which elevates it above simply being an aesthetic. Thank you.
So could you go back to the PowerPoint for a second, if that's possible? I'd quite like to look at that sonnet image of G.G. Rossetti. Yes, that one. I thought it was a really interesting talk, very strong, and I enjoyed it. I mean, I've got a lot of questions. I mean, first of all, you said that you used the word reactionary about the PRB, and that's not normally the kind of agreed perception of what they were up to. So, how do you mean?
In the way that they wanted to rebel against existing norms. They were sort of, rather than having, I would say that they're reactionary because rather than having one set of aims, they were reacting against something which existed. A lot of the time their kind of, their interests didn't necessarily match up. So I think you couldn't really describe them as a sort of linear kind of group.
So it's not political reaction. Can you think about reaction? You think about, I don't know, Nigel Farage or something like that. You know, they're kind of, are they revolutionary? Well, what struck me as a romancist is quite how close those tenets of PRB were to Wordsworth's preface to the local ballads, because plainly a really big influence on on this crowd are the Romantic poets. You know, Keats, most particularly, the Belle dans son Mercy and the Eve of St Agnes. And that, of course, is a bit like Blake, isn't it? So, what's going on? Is that a colour illustration or black and white?
No, it's black and white. It's black and white illustration again.
And is it like Blake? It's engraved onto a metal plate and then onto the page, or was it a woodcut?
It's a woodcut again, a printed woodcut illustration, which was given to, I think it was his mother as a birthday gift. So
it's from so that's a page from a book. That's not just an illustrated version of one of his poems.
Yes, it is an illustrated version of one of his poems that he gave as a gift to his mother.
Right, so it's kind of one-off rather than I mean, what do you think about the stunners? You said they were kind of lifelike, but they're not really very lifelike, are they? You don't see too many of those on central bars. I mean, how are they lifelike compared to what?
In comparison to, you mean the image of the women?
The stunners, as they call them.
Yeah. They seem more lifelike than the image of the Victorian woman, which their poses are more active. They're sort of, the Victorian lady appears sort of statuesque, whereas these women actually appear that they're kind of doing something. They're in a scene rather than being a posed model. So I felt that sort of gave them a bit of sort of a kind of more lifelike feel, perhaps, than the strictly posed sort of Victorian lady, which was again kind of rebelling against the sort of traditional image of women.
I like the way in which you kind of qualified the kind of feminist credentials of the PRB. But where do you stand in terms of, there is a kind of feminist critique of the pre-Raphaelites, which kind of wags its finger and says, you know, they're subjecting women to the male gaze, etc., 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 and it's kind of telling them off in a way. I mean, where do you stand on the sexual politics of this?
I'm quite ambivalent on it. I very much like the paintings, but there does seem to be an element in certainly some of the paintings of it kind of objectifying, being kind of maybe a bit disrespectful perhaps, but not all of them, not necessarily, as I've said. It's sort of not exactly a linear kind of movement. So I think it would be sort of unfair to say that it was all sexist or something like that. I think it's a bit more complex than that. I think it's more of an enjoyment of kind of female aesthetic than a sort of active objectifying.
Thanks.
I think someone's out there.